This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we're talking to the Dungeon Dudes about their new 5e module, the Dungeons of Drakkenheim. All that and more coming up right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, your favourite D&D and tabletop role-playing game podcast. My name is Ben Byrne.
Hello humans, my name is Dael Kingsmill.
I am Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin. And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
Thank you so much for indulging me on that one, the two of you, and Dael as well. But also, thank you for joining us, regular viewers. Obviously wondering, Sean and James have changed shape mysteriously. Not quite. We have let them have a week off, and we are here with Monty and Kelly from the Dungeon Dudes.
Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever seen Sean and James and the Dungeon Dudes in the same room?
Have we had a show with obviously no. I don't think those two have come up to Canada yet, so
you're on to us. You're on to the secrets.
The Canadian counterparts.
Yeah.
Monty, let me ask you a quick question. If you were to escape into any fantasy or sci-fi realm that you could, what do you think you would want to escape into? Where would you want to go if you could live there for a year?
I think probably the best science fiction fantasy world to live in, if you were actually going to live there, would probably be Star Trek. Yeah. I feel like that's where you could actually live, because it's a very optimistic setting. Right? Like, it's not there are existential threats and all sorts of dangers. It's also like a world where you can explore and have wacky adventures. And I feel like for the typical person, living life, you could go on some great vacations. You could see some amazing places. You could probably eat some really good food. And it's not a universe where all of us, it is a universe where all of a sudden a monster is going to come out and kill you. But I feel like that's only if you're in Starfleet.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's like joining the military, right? You're invariably in more danger in that situation.
But you can go to Picard's vineyard and just chill out, right? Yeah.
Dael, what about you? Where would you go? Which universe would you want to escape into?
My gut instinct is Narnia. I've loved the Narnia books since I was a little kid, and I feel like it's got kind of a similar balance of there's enough drama going on that is going to stay interesting, but also for the most part it's pretty chill, and I can just hang out with some talking animals if I don't
totally
want to die.
The talking animals are definitely a bonus there. Kelly, what about you? Fantasy, sci-fi? Do you have a preference? Where would you want to live?
Well, I'm going to answer your question with another question. In my escape to this fantasy world, am I a heroic character or am I an NPC? Because I think in the answer that Monty gave, this is if you're a regular person in Star Trek, my go-to answer would be to escape to Star Wars. But if I escape to the worlds of Star Wars, I want to be like a Padawan in the Jedi Academy, preferably during the era pre the Sith takeover and the destruction of the Jedi Order and all of that, like during the prime time where you could go to school to be a Jedi and help people around the world with your Jedi powers. Great. But if I'm going in there and I'm a moisture farmer on Tatooine, that's not really going to be the greatest time. So it does depend on that for me. But if I could be a Jedi in Star Wars, that's my childhood dream come true, and I would live that life.
What about Sorry, go ahead, Monty.
The other I think S tier, just be an NPC is probably the Shire.
Yeah,
oh yeah, eat cheese, smoke pipe weed.
Oh yes, go to so many Hobbit parties.
Yeah.
You're right. If I could if I could escape to Lord of the Rings, but not during the War of the One Ring, and just live a happy life in the Shire, that would be great.
I think you're right. I would never have thought of Star Trek because I'm not a huge Star Trek fan myself. And in fact, a lot of the media I'm into is dark fantasy. All the worlds kind of suck. I'm I don't really want to go to any of these places. But the Shire, I actually think that's a really good call. I would probably also want to go there. Speaking of a world that I would not want to escape into, if I'm being completely honest, is the world of Drakkenheim, which is the brainchild, I believe, of Monty Martin and Kelly McLaughlin. You are a player within the world, or have been a player within the world, or are a player, still are, past tense, present tense. I'm not sure yet, because gods know it would be past tense for me. I would not survive this place. Dungeons of Drakkenheim is the point that I'm getting to. Just so everybody knows, while I feel very special to have this is just an alpha version. It is not in any way a final product. Let's all show our Drakkenheim dungeons. That being said, I have been flicking through this, and it is my jam, like massively so. I mentioned a second ago, I'm hugely into dark fantasy and that whole kind of, hard decision making. The world sucks because it's, I don't know, something about it really scratches my brain in a positive way. That was a weird sentence. Anyway, the question that I'm building to, Monty, is give me the elevator pitch for Drakkenheim. If I'm someone who's never watched one of your streams or, just see this book and I'm like, that looks super cool, I want to know what that is. What is the Dungeons of Drakkenheim, or what are the Dungeons of Drakkenheim?
Yeah, so Dungeons of Drakkenheim is a dark fantasy adventure set in a ruined city caught between eldritch horror and faction conflict, and it is all bound together by the personal stories of the player characters who will ultimately decide the fate of Drakkenheim. So we really, in building Drakkenheim, we wanted to combine a world where the player characters felt like they could be the movers and shakers in it in a really profound way, and have that personal story, but also cast that against a world of conflicts and inscrutable, maddening horror. And so it's very much, for me, it's a world of really deep contrasts in that respect, because I think that one of the things that I love about cosmic horror so specifically is that it really magnifies the kind of the existential dread of the human condition. And for us, pairing that horror with the decision making of a faction-based conflict where the player characters are in control of what's going to happen next really highlights how, in a cosmic horror sort of way, it's left to the human protagonists to figure out what to do in the face of horrible truths about reality and impending madness. So that is the elevator pitch. In terms of the story, though, Kelly, do you want to say, what is the story of Drakkenheim?
Well, the story of Drakkenheim is about a city that was struck by an Eldritch meteor 15 years prior to the outset of the campaign. And Drakkenheim itself, the city, was the capital of Westamar. So it had a very important role in the continent. The royal family known as the Von Kessels were the leaders of the entire continent and kind of held it together. But with the meteor crashing down on the city, the kingdom was shattered, the royal heirs were lost, and what came afterwards was a long civil war between people trying to claim a throne that was crumbling under the weight of this eldritch horror spread by this mysterious meteor. And what ends up happening is, after several attempts to reclaim the city that didn't go well because of all the monsters and madness inhabiting the horrible ruins, your characters now arrive at Drakkenheim for their own goals. And one of the systems that we built into the book is the personal goal system. So each player character chooses a personal quest that is driving them to stay and push forward in the ruins of Drakkenheim. But along the way, they meet several groups of people who are also battling for control over the city. And through their adventures and the NPCs that they interact with, they get to choose who their allies are going to be and who their enemies are going to be while they traverse the dangerous ruins, trying to figure out what is to be done with delirium, the mysterious crystals left behind by the meteor, and what to do with the royal line and the throne of Drakkenheim.
There's powerful magic in Drakkenheim now because the delirium has brought new forms of magic and unlocked new types of spells and magic items that can be created. So many adventurers come to the city seeking it to make their fortunes, and the factions all have... We've developed 5 factions, and all of them have a different opinion on whether the delirium should be used for magic items, whether it should be worshipped as a harbinger of a divine prophecy, or whether it should just be destroyed. And some of the factions, they don't know yet. They just want to piece together the ruins. So there's a kind of this multifaceted decision making, and ultimately it falls on the players to decide who's going to be the villain of the campaign. And depending on some of the choices, some players might feel like ours did and be looking at themselves going, are we the villains?
There's a lot of D&D campaigns, to be fair. We've definitely had that moment where the players all look at each other and they're like, uh-oh. This is like super layered as well. Like the more you talk about it, this is a world with like massive fidelity, which I think is really cool. You know, if you're looking for a game to pick up, a campaign to pick up that's, multi-layered and you can kind of dive really deeply into and mine it really deeply, Drakkenheim sounds really awesome. What I'm kind of curious about is that, like, did you design this as a product first and foremost, or this came off your stream? Was this like a world that you had been playing within just, behind closed doors and it had slowly developed over time?
It was a world that as we were starting to build a following on YouTube, we started hearing from more and more people that were watching our channel. We want to watch you guys play D&D. Right. And originally we had a bunch of ideas of where we would go from it, whether we were going to just run the official modules for 5th edition, whether we were going to come up with something new. But I'd had this idea in my back pocket for a while, and originally it kind of started like, part of the reason why I chose it was like, I'm not precious about this. If it doesn't go well, I'm not going to be brokenhearted. If no one likes it, I won't be depressed about it. It'll be really open-ended. We'll be able to see where it goes, and we can kind of do it in an episodic format. Because fundamentally, what's cool about the way the book turned out is that if you just wanted to take the locations in the city and use them for one-shots, it's really easy to do that. But then if you do want to layer on top of all the conflict and intrigue on top of that, all the guidelines are there for it as well. So it really wasn't until about, I would say, towards the end of the first season of the show, which is 52 episodes, that was really when we were starting to hear the loud clamoring from people that were just leaving comments on the episodes of like, is this a book or can we get Monty's DM notes? And that's where it really took off, and the idea germinated that, oh yeah, maybe we should compile all this and make this into something that we can share in a new way for others to experience.
Yeah, there's like I call it the action figure effect, right? With, just based on my own personal experience, which is when I was a little kid, I used to watch Batman the Animated Series, and I wanted Batman action figures to create my own, like Batman stories. And I think that there's a lot of power in you see, even as an adult, you see something that you like, that you connect with, and you want the action figure or a version of that thing that you can kind of take and explore at your own pace, as you were playing through the campaign. Obviously, decisions were made by the party, and I have no doubt that so many people were sitting there going like, what would I do? What character would I create for Drakkenheim? And this obviously gives them that opportunity. The thing that I really enjoy, I was flicking through it, the first thing I always do when I pick up any adventure module, whether it's like a Wizards of the Coast official module or something else, is flick to the back and look at the monsters. As a dungeon master, that's always what I want to do first. There are some really cool things back there, but actually what I want to talk about, because it took my fancy or it caught my attention as I was flicking through the back of the book, is the contamination rules. You mentioned delirium as this stone, this magical object that contaminates and corrupts anybody who comes in contact with it, or it, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, it kind of like gives off a haze that even like being near it can cause you to become contaminated. Can you walk me through a little bit of the contamination rules? And I don't know how you came up with them, how you found it affected your campaign during the stream, because they're such a delicious extra layer on a campaign. Like for me, the contamination status is Drakkenheim. Like that's really what sets it apart from anything else.
Yeah. So Kelly, what you've experienced it as a player? Tell us about it.
How horrible was it? Like on a scale of 1 to this sucks. Like,
so my favorite thing about contamination is so Monty and I are very much in the mindset that like killing player characters sometimes sucks, and death is kind of hard in 5th edition sometimes, although maybe not in Drakkenheim. But we wanted something that added to the fear and horror of a campaign setting, which is hard to do in 5th edition because you're playing epic fantasy. So what the contamination rules really do, and I have experienced this as a player, is this constant feeling of dread. When you're in an area where you can be contaminated, the contamination system, we borrowed ideas from the exhaustion system. So there's 6 levels of contamination. And the first level of contamination doesn't have any negative effects. But each time you gain a level of contamination, you roll a d6. And if you roll your number of contamination levels or lower, you get a mutation. And then you roll on the mutation chart to see what you get. Some are beneficial, some are detrimental, but we very much took all of our favorite ideas from like cosmic horror and movies like The Thing or the works of H.P. Lovecraft to really explore what the body mutations might look and feel like. So there's elements of body horror in there as well. But as a player, each time that Monty makes us check for contamination, you get that first level, and maybe you do get a mutation, and it's something like you can squeeze through small holes, or you can breathe underwater, and you're like, oh, that's not too bad. But then next thing you know, you have 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels, and suddenly the mutations start to change. I don't want to give away too many spoilers on our show, but there was a recent instance where one of our player characters ended up with 5 levels of contamination and 4 different mutations. And it was horrifying to see happen at the table. They were no longer really themselves. They were a walking fish spider with a belly maw that was chasing after us to kill us.
Oh no.
And it was terrifying. And if he had gained 1 more level of contamination, what happens at level 6 is you transform into a monster at the DM's discretion. So the DM gets to choose what you transform into. There are some ways to reverse it, but those are extremely difficult and require sort of its own adventure within Drakkenheim to find out how to reverse a monstrous transformation. So getting to level 6 is almost as good as dead, and now you have a monster companion that you have to deal with if you want to try to save them.
Yeah, for sure.
What makes contamination really challenging is that, unlike exhaustion, it doesn't go away when you rest. And we were very specific in that contamination under the rules of 5th edition is neither a poison, nor a disease, nor a curse. And so the existing magic that affects that player characters would normally use to overcome such things, contamination is completely alien. So in Drakkenheim, we've created a set of new spells that the player characters can unlock to protect them against contamination. The first one of which is a spell that does purge all your contamination out, but it trades the contamination levels for exhaustion. So it becomes, it's a problem that the one of the things that we were very inspired by in creating Drakkenheim is a lot of the sort of Castlevania / Metroid sorts of games where the player characters have to unlock a new ability or a new attribute in order to survive in a new environment. So the way the spells and magic items that protect the player characters against contamination are designed is so that as the players find these spells and research them and build these magic items, they're able to explore the most dangerous areas of Drakkenheim without being immediately overwhelmed by the contamination. Then the only problem they have to deal with is the scary monsters. So it's something. It is that exploration focus is something we were really interested in achieving with the contamination as well, because the other big effect that it does is the haze that covers Drakkenheim that causes all the wild magic. Its basic property is you can't take a long rest in the haze.
Gotcha.
So every adventure begins with the player characters going into Drakkenheim and coming out. So that has a huge effect just on the whole structure of the adventure, in that we kind of avoid that whole thing where the players go use all their spells on the first encounter in the dungeon and then rest outside, because if you want to get into explore Drakkenheim, you have to fight your way through the city streets, achieve your objectives, and then get out. And one of the things we wrote in our random encounter system is that one day in your campaign, your player characters will have a moment where they've expended all their resources, they're low on hit points, and they're stuck in the middle of the city. The first time this happens, you should be merciful. The second time this happens, show no mercy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when you pointed out that it's not a poison or a disease, I was like, yeah, no, it's not. I just think it's incredibly cleverly designed, and there's something about the exhaustion mechanics in base 5th edition that just kind of don't work for me in terms of like what they're meant to represent. I think it's because they're a little too debilitating in a weird way, and players often, once they gain a level or two of exhaustion, kind of disengage from the game and start sitting at the back and letting the rest of the party do the heavy lifting. What I like about the contamination from a design point of view is that it takes that, evolves that idea, twists it, if you will, and it just... It gives buffs, like you said, as well as debuffs, but also enforces role-playing changes as well. You know, the way the character is role-played has to change. It reminds me of a warlock I had in a campaign a while ago that had a Great Old One as a pact. And the idea was that the god is like forcing their energy through a mortal body, which just physically cannot sustain such magic and power. And so he was changing slowly over the course of the campaign, and we had no mechanics for it. Like the contamination system would have been perfect for it. It was just every time he cast a high level spell, we just decided, all right, now one of your fingers is like a crab leg, and now one of your eyes has kind of like changed color or whatever, until he was slowly turning into this monster. But I think you also got to have a fair bit of player buy-in as well, in terms of like, yes, you can mess with my character sheet, or yes, you can change my character. Dael, is this like, have you played with these sort of mechanics in your games in terms of enforcing buffs and debuffs on players based on story elements?
I mean, nothing that has ever looked exactly like this, but the thing I'm excited about with this is I love trying to come up with penalties that take the form of boosts, right? Like, you get a buff, but really ultimately it's a bad thing. I love doing that, where it's like, mechanically this is good, narratively we all know it's terrible. I'm a big fan of sort of carrot stick, but like with a lot of carrot. Hand them a bunch of good stuff now, but make sure that they know that it's gonna go bad at some point. So indulging too much is kind of the risk reward there.
To bounce off of that, even an example, one of the mechanics that I love that we put in here is a lot of the mutations have a rule that if you're level 4 contamination or higher, the mutation changes. So an example would be one of the mutations that I mentioned earlier. You grow gills and you can now breathe underwater, and you have a swimming speed. But if you are level 4 contamination or more, you can now only breathe underwater. So it kind of represents that as you start to get contaminated, you might be like, oh, look at all these cool powers I'm gaining.
Sick.
But yeah, and then like as it gets worse and worse, you're like, I'm turning into a fish. This isn't good. Yeah. So it slowly gets worse and worse. But there's been times in the game where you get 1 or 2 mutations and you're like, maybe I can just ride along with this for a while. And that was the other key, is we want players not to get one level of contamination and go, oh no, time to backtrack out of Drakkenheim. It's, oh, this might be useful. Maybe I can push forward. And we want to like play with that idea of tempting them to maybe stick around with their contamination until suddenly they're at contamination level 5, realizing they're an inch away from turning into a horrible monster.
And that's it, isn't it? It's temptation. I feel like temptation, to me, is the key to any design that wants to eventually do something horrible to a player character, right? because it's nasty, it's horrible, it's bad. So you have to tempt the players into making that choice themselves. It has to have been on them, not on you. Because if you just say to your player, well, now you're a fish, without any warning, that's terrible, and you're gonna probably make them upset. But if they know that this is bad, it's got a name like contamination. If they know it's bad, but they get tempted along that line, they keep following it, they keep going, then that's on them. That's their choice, and that's what makes it so juicy and good.
And where we built on that was we developed, it was one of our stretch goals, contaminated spells. So there's spells in the book that if you cast them, you gain a contamination level, and they are all spells that are basically a contaminated version of a spell in the core rules that is turned up to 11 because of the contaminated effects. So one of our favorite is Conjure the Deep Haze, which is cloud kill, but the victims are also contaminated by the cloud kill. It's a monstrously effective spell, but you as the caster also become contaminated in the process. So we wanted to make sure that there was an active thing that said, hey, here's something that's really, really, really powerful, but you gotta take the hit.
Speaking of the layers, that we were talking about before, I also wanted to talk about, because it seems to be one of the other major aspects of Drakkenheim, and I think a major aspect to a lot of really successful urban campaigns, which Drakkenheim, is it an urban campaign? Is it a wilderness adventure? It's kind of a bit of both, right? Like it's a urban environment that got turned into a wilderness when the meteor shower fell upon it. But is the factions, the faction rivalry, which are described in the book as like the way for the dungeon master to think about them is as NPCs that are made up of a host of individuals trying to do many different things at any different time. I think that's a very clever way to describe it, though, because it makes it feel not so overwhelming, and just think of it like, oh, okay, there are like 5 people here that all want different things and are trying to make up their mind about different things, rather than like, oh, I've got like armies of different NPCs that I have to cultivate. What's your approach, I suppose, to faction, elaborating on that, to factionalism within games of D&D, and how to run it as a game master, how to keep it easy and engaging for the players as well?
I think for me, having run the factions, we've been inspired by so many systems that do use factions in a very active way. One of the biggest inspirations for me in Drakkenheim, and this is kind of like the secret that I think some people don't actually catch on to, is Fallout New Vegas is is a huge influence on Drakkenheim, because if you replace meteor shower with nuclear bombs, you get the same thing. It's just in the future. So really, in a lot of ways, the Fallout universe was a huge, like, fantasizing Fallout was a huge part of that, because you have nuclear mutants and ghouls and ruined cities and factions fighting over it. And for me, the biggest thing in Drakkenheim that sets it differently from, I think, other faction-based things is there's a tendency in a lot of faction-based media that underscores an idea called unite the factions, where the goal is, let's get past all of our differences and work together to achieve against a common enemy. In Drakkenheim, it's a bit of a fake out, because the factions all want very different things, and they fundamentally will not agree on anything. And so much like in Fallout, in Fallout New Vegas, there is no way to make the NCR and Caesar's Legion work together. It just won't happen. And so there are several factions in Drakkenheim that you could see them working together on a short-term basis, but they have fundamentally different goals. And so that for us, rather than taking a video game logic of having like all these extra mechanics on top of the factions, we treated the factions like NPCs, gave them ideals, bonds, flaws, personality traits, and then gave them goals. And we spell out in the book, this is what it is. These are what the factions want. Role play them like an NPC, and then use your judgment as a dungeon master to respond. So we tried to give a toolbox of ways to use the factions rather than building out what I would call a subsystem. It's more learn about them, learn about how they are. Because when I ran the original campaign, I didn't use like special rules for running factions. I just knew who they were and made decisions based on the actions of the player characters. And so for me, it was much more organic than that. And that's the key thing with it.
Dael, have you run a lot of factional conflict in your campaigns before?
I have prepared a lot of factional conflict that my players have deftly dodged away from. So, I have lots of documents full of information about factions that somehow have never been useful. But I hope one day
they'll get there. The thing that I enjoy about running factionalized campaigns is that when you run the same campaign twice, it'll never turn out the same. And it's because you might have, multiple factions that are moralizing along different lines. You might have multiple, to use the alignments as descriptive rather than prescriptive, but good factions who ultimately want altruistic things, but it might be the way that they go about it is different, or they might be, the specific end that they want might be different. And so when you get different players playing with those factions, they, every person has a different vibe about what they think is right and wrong. And so you always get a different result whenever you're playing in a campaign that has multiple different factions pulling in different directions.
One of my favorite things about the factions that we created when we were designing them, and I actually think this is well represented on our show, is no matter what faction the party aligns themselves with, they're going to find out that there are some dark secrets within that faction. So what I think is interesting is in our show, we allied very heavily with the Amethyst Academy, which is the sort of wizards spellcaster organization. And there's a lot of people who are like, I don't trust the Amethyst Academy. They're not the good guys. You should have gone with so-and-so. A lot of people, we ended up turning on, to name the 5 factions, we have the Amethyst Academy, which is the sort of magical mages who want to gain access back to their base of operations that was lost in Drakkenheim. We have the Silver Order, who is a group of paladins who has come to Drakkenheim in hopes of cleansing the city of this horrible contamination. We have the Falling Fire, which is a new religious sect who has decided to worship the delirium crystals and the meteor, and they see it as a heaven-sent, prophecy that they're now bringing people to in hopes of fulfilling this great future that they see. We have the Hooded Lanterns, which is sort of the military group who's fighting to reclaim the throne of Drakkenheim. And then we have the Queen of Thieves, who has organized all the bandits around Drakkenheim and is kind of just hoping to mess things up and has some ulterior motives, but I want to leave that for if you end up joining the Queen of Thieves. But what was really great is we joined the Amethyst Academy and ended up making an alliance with the Hooded Lanterns. And through that, you got to really get to know those 2 factions, but we ended up making enemies of the Silver Order and the Queen's Men. And
you were allied with the Silver Order for half the campaign, and then you turned on them. Don't sugarcoat it. You turned on them in a brutal betrayal.
Okay, that's fair. It was horrible. We murdered their leader in cold blood. But A lot of people are like, you should have stayed with the Silver Order. And I'm sure that if you join the Silver Order at the outset of the campaign, you're going to question the whole time, like, should we have joined one of the other factions?
Sure.
And that's what's really important about the Drakkenheim campaign. And actually a message to DMs hoping to run it is believe in every faction equally as a DM, but also be well aware to play up their flaws and their inability to see things from the other people's perspective. And what you're going to get is a difficult choice that no matter what faction they ally with, the players are going to have to choose. Well, if they're allying with one, they're making an enemy of another. And the one that they're allied with might have some great answers, but not all of them. And no matter what, you're going to leave mysteries unsolved because you can't ally with every faction.
One of the things that's very funny is, when we started the campaign several years ago, oftentimes people would ask questions of like, why can't all the factions work together? I mean, there's such a horrible danger that threatens the entire world. And why isn't everyone working together? No one seems to ask that question anymore.
Where have we seen that recently?
And so I think for me, that's kind of the fun thing about it is that, and it's a joke that comes up several times of like, we often see like, why isn't this faction acting rationally? Why won't they listen to reason and logic? And I wrote that in the book of saying like, the factions are made of people and people don't always act in logical ways. They let their emotions and their beliefs and their opinions, sometimes two sets of people can have all the same facts on the table and ultimately conclude two very different things. And I wanted to explore that with this whole, in a fantasy, extrapolated to a fantasy so we can get away from the real world.
Yeah.
but that idea of, what does it mean to work together and what does it mean to actually have fundamental disagreements over things, and how do you navigate that? Because ultimately the players then get to decide during the campaign who inevitably the players might not want to make enemies, but they will by virtue of their choices. And then they'll have to decide, what does that mean for them? And what does that mean for how they're going to make the next decision?
That makes me think of, what's that line from Men in Black where he says, no, a person is smart, but people are dumb, panicky animals.
I think about that line a lot, actually. It's a good line.
Yeah.
Well, Dungeons of Drakkenheim was a Kickstarter last year. It should be arriving mid-2022 if you backed it, and it will be available for sale. I suddenly feel like Colbert or something. I'm like, check out catch my ring light in the thing. Check out Dungeons of Drakkenheim coming in mid-2022. It will be for sale if you missed the Kickstarter through the Ghostfire gaming store, and I know I'm definitely looking forward to it. Well, speaking of is a phrase that I say a lot. And speaking of things, I wanted to, because we talked a little bit about Drakkenheim's origins, if you will, as an idea that was scratching around the back of your brain, Monty. I guess I wanted to have a quick discussion about the approach to world building, which is a huge discussion and more than we necessarily have time for here. But I guess what I would like to start with is like, where do you start? If you're a game master, and not all game masters have this need to create their own thing, it's perfectly fine to run, me neither, for the record. It's perfectly fine to use things like, a pre-written adventure, something like Dungeons of Drakkenheim, either way that you go. But if you are a game master or you're getting into the hobby and you're like, I really want to create my own thing, I really want to have my own world, I guess, like, what are the starting points? Where should you begin? Dael?
I don't know whether this is going to be like a helpful answer in any way, but I'm going to say it regardless. I think you start with whatever is exciting to you, right? Because I don't think I've ever started world building from the same place twice.
Sure.
It's always just like, what was the little spark of an idea that made you excited about it? Start from there and build outwards. Which, I mean, it's not concrete at all, but it's if that is a place, if you're like, what if there was a city that was on the edge of a volcano, but instead of lava, it's, magic, or negative energy. I don't know. This is an idea that you can tell is just coming out of my head right at this second. But, start with that. Build the city. What's in the city? Who's in the city? And from there, you can start doing more concrete things. Like you can start, the place that I like to start when I'm building factions or building a city or anything like that is, when I was in high school ancient history class, they wanted us to remember the several different important aspects of a society that they wanted us to talk about in an essay. They were like, don't forget to mention all of these 5 things. And to make us remember it, they gave us an acronym. And what better way to make teenagers remember an acronym than for it to be a little bit crude? So the acronym was SPERM, which stood for social, political, economic, religious, and military. I don't think it's that rude, but when I mentioned it on my channel, some people were very deeply offended. So my apologies if any of those people are listening now. But anyway, SPERM, social, political, economic, religious, and military. And it's something that I've remembered ever since then. And that I think is really useful for world building, because you can look at a city and you go, okay, well, I need something that represents the religious faction. I need something that represents the economy. What is the economy of this town? And you can do sort of a mini version of that when you're building factions as well. Who's the social center of this faction? Who's the sort of military head of this faction? And even if your faction is a church, there's going to be some twist on those things that you can add in there. It just helps it to feel full fairly quickly. So there's my very flimsy, not good advice about where to start, and then some slightly more concrete advice on how to start.
No, I think any advice that we give, right, as James often says, is right for you, the game master, whoever you are at the time that you're creating something. So I think that's actually really good advice, because the way that you create, the way that I create, the way that Kelly and Monty create is going to be different to the way that another game master might start. But it's good to have, a palette of different ideas on how to get started so that you can choose what works for you. Kelly, do you... Sorry, go ahead, Dad.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it's like if you were excited about the monsters, if the first thing you do is flip to the back and look at the monsters, then maybe that's where your world building begins. What kind of monsters are in this place? If you're excited about the character classes that are available, start there, build outwards. It's literally follow the rabbit of happiness.
Follow the rabbit of happiness. We should get that on a bumper sticker or something. Kelly, do you do much game mastering yourself, or do much designing yourself?
I do. I do run my own home game. I've ran a few things on our stream as well. Okay. I generally, the reason for the divide is mostly Monty has a preference of being a DM, and I actually have a preference of being a player. But we both love the other side of it as well, just like a little bit less than the other one. But I do love running games. I have created many, many worlds as well. So I definitely do have a creative mind. I contributed a lot to some of the locations in Drakkenheim that were added in the book. I got to come to Monty with all of my cool ideas, and we kind of hashed those in and filled the world out a bit more with those as well.
Does that mean that when you're running the stream, you're like, oh, I came up with this. This is awesome. When Monty pulls it out of his hat.
We had a terrible moment the other day where one of my favorite monsters that I created nearly killed one of our player characters, and I watched it happen, and I was just like, man, why did we make this thing so scary? And I'm just sitting there like, I'm the one who pitched this idea to Monty. Yeah, I came to Monty the one day, I'm like, what if we had a mix of a banshee and a ghost, but when it possesses you, it contaminates and mutates you? And we're like, yeah, and then it was awful. And I love it. But as a player, I was like, man, those things are scary. But it's fun to see. And I also do have to like tug on my acting chops. Even we had a big revelation in the last episode. And when the revelation happened, I was like, in character, I was like, oh my God, how is this happening? And then after the stream, Jill and Joe, who we play with, turned to me and they were like, what? And I'm like, oh, right, you guys didn't actually know what was happening. And it was such, like, I forgot that Monty and I knew, but the other two players didn't.
Sure.
And that is a weird separation as a player, but I've gotten really good at when I'm a player, I don't worry about what I know. I worry about what my character's up to. Because I read so much D&D that, like, when we have a troll in front of us, I'm not like, oh, hit it with fire. I'm like, would my character know to hit it with fire? Or is that something that we need to discover? Or, like, you know, that's kind of a bad example because I think I always yell out hit it with fire. But that kind of idea of, like, just trying to separate what I know and having fun being a character.
I feel like that's a bad luck Brian meme, is like, create really cool monster, DM uses it against me. Monty, what about you? Where do you start from?
So for me, I often start with my influences. And I got into tabletop games through a huge through loving history and loving playing lots of Warhammer Fantasy and loving video games, but also a lot of reading. And I think one of the things that I like to remind dungeon masters is part of being a creative and creating things is also making sure that you are fueling the engine of your creativity with good fuel. And that means reading books. I think that too often, video games, movies, and TV shows get to be the dominant forms of influences because of their influence on gaming. But novels are so much like if you read more as a dungeon master, it's the equivalent of like going on a bodybuilder's diet for creating. Like I would say that like video games and movies and TV shows are great, but they kind of are the fast food of inspiration, because in many cases, a lot of video games are just rehashing influences that came from books. So I like to go to the source, and when I am creating, I like to read more. Even in the process of making Drakkenheim in the original stream, I was reading N.K. Jemisin, and I was reading Ursula K. Le Guin, and I was reading H.P. Lovecraft. And so I was swimming in all of that literature. And I think that when you are getting inspired by other material, it just bleeds into the creative process, and eventually it's like you fill your brain, like you fill your belly, and you can't help but word vomit. And eventually there'll be nuggets of beautiful things in that word vomit that you can hammer into a campaign.
I think that's really, really solid advice, because I mentioned before we started streaming, I've started running an Office Grimhollow campaign, and it's probably because I haven't started from scratch with a campaign for a very long time. A lot of the time when I'm running games, I'm running stuff that I've already run before, 7 or 8 times over. But starting from scratch has been an interesting experience where I'm like, all right, so I've got a big city. It's got a tavern in it and a and it's kind of like slowly forming the ideas. And I think that I think you're right. Maybe engaging with some reading would help kind of motivate that a little bit more, help kind of like fill up the tank a little bit more. That feels like it's a bit empty on new ideas at the moment from years of creating D&D campaigns.
Yeah, and I would say that like you can also turn to history, and I think podcasts and audiobooks are also like S tier. If I would not everyone can like has the focus or the time to read. So like, if you have a commute and you normally listen to music, listen to an audiobook or listen to like a good history podcast, or consume something that will give you that kind of energy in there, because I think that when you because ultimately, if you're just a little bit more well-read than your players, you can kind of borrow stuff wholesale and they're not going to notice.
Yeah, for sure.
I think what is really important about reading specifically is that us as DMs, it's a verbal medium that we're delivering to our players. We have to use words to paint pictures. So while movies and video games and all of that are great for inspiration, actually reading gives you new ways of describing things, new ways of exploring the language, the art of language to create. And when you as a DM have read more and have this encyclopedia of ways to describe a creepy house, because you've read 1,000 stories of creepy houses. You now don't just have to be like, you walk into a creepy house. You're going to have more evocative ways to tell those stories because of all the consuming you did of language.
Very solid advice there. I agree wholeheartedly with that. I have nothing to add. But we are going to bring it to a close there. That is all we have time for today on this episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Monty and Kelly, you collectively are the Dungeon Dudes. If people want to learn more about Drakkenheim or watch some of your campaign, where can they find you?
You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Dungeon Dudes. And you can also punch in Drakkenheim.com, and that'll take you to the Ghostfire store if you want to pre-order the actual books and all this good stuff.
Yeah. One thing I did want to quickly show, because we have versions of the Kickstarter kind of collector's edition. Now, this is just empty. This is not an actual edition of the book, because these are still, like I said, alphas. But when I saw this, I was like, that's got to make the two of you happy. Like, that's pretty.
It's cool.
That's pretty
so
cool. Awesome. If you want to keep the conversation going with the Dungeon Dudes, with myself, with Dael, we have our Twitter handles just below our names. You can also email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Ask us a question, start a conversation, get us talking, and in the meanwhile, just like the Contamination of Drakkenheim, go out and spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast. Tell it to all your D&D and tabletop role-playing game friends, because we are here every week.
Just like it. It's just like the Contamination.
You might get some mutations as well. Who knows?
Go tell your friends about the Eldritch Lorecast. Become a fish.
Yeah, that's our new slogan, exactly. We will catch you all next week.